Well, unfortunately, there's really only one scenario that we need to look at, and that's the ground invasion of Gaza. The Israeli intelligence system clearly screwed up and missed what has been the largest operation in this area in at least the last 30 years, arguably since the independence of Israel in the first place. And it was a topic that supposedly this was the only thing that the Israeli intelligence services were watching. So the degree that the Israeli government dropped the ball is extreme. This isn't like 9/11 where it was a Hail Mary from a different hemisphere. This is stuff that was happening directly under their nose where they're supposed to be watching every single day. And the only way that the Israelis now can deal with it is to roll into Gaza and go house to house. Because if they had good intel on where these people were, then the attacks would have never happened in the first place. So they've got to do it the old fashioned way. And that means sifting through an area with a population of 2.3 million people in order to find the perpetrators and to rip up Hamas by the roots. There is no way that that is pretty. Probably relatively low. Egypt is a security partner of the Israelis, has been for 30 years. And they used to control the Gaza Strip between 1949 and 1973, and they hated it. So there's no love lost between the Palestinians and the Egyptians. And while the Egyptians will not say this publicly, they are thrilled with what is about to happen.
No.
Uh, yeah, Jordan is a satellite state of Israel that is basically paid for with international aid, primarily from the United States. So that's not a security threat either. Syria is in a civil war. They don't have the capacity to control their own territory, much less do something at the Golan. That just leaves Lebanon, which is a failed state. And while Hezbollah has some teeth, what they don't have is an army. So they might be able to launch some rockets over, and that might cause some heartburn in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. But it's not a traditional invasion. So, from the Israeli point of view, all of the local states are known quantities. The only questions that matter then are Iran and Saudi Arabia. In the case of the Iranians, they have some missiles that could reach Iran, but nothing that can change the balance of forces on the ground. They certainly can't deploy an army because they'd have to go through Iraq and Syria just to get there in the first place. That's well beyond their capabilities. And then there's Saudi Arabia. Now, the Saudis have been pushing for a direct alliance with the Israelis. They've been quiet security partners for the last 20 years. Basically, whenever the United States has said something less than complimentary about the Saudis or the Israelis, the two of them get closer together. And Israel has become a transit point for American weapons technology and training into Saudi Arabia now for quite some time. And they were trying to formalize that relationship. The question now is whether that's still going to move forward. And that is subject to an internal debate within Riyadh that's intergenerational. The king's generation, the older folks, liked the idea of the Palestinian cause and thought that any deal that was going to proceed had to include something for the Palestinians as well. The younger generation, that includes the crown prince, thinks the opposite, thinks that the Palestinians are wastes of skin and just need to be disappeared into history so they can get on with the real work of Saudi power. And so they are now having a debate internally about how seriously to take this. And when they're done with that debate, which will probably be within a month, we're going to have a very firm idea of what Saudi plans are for the next 20 years. Well, keep in mind that the Middle East is run by a series of autocrats. So you've got your political elite, in the case of the Saudis, the royal family, who control all the levers of power. And then you have the street that has to be managed. And obviously, the street is boiling right now. But this isn't the first time this has happened. And it is very, very, very rare that the street can actually overthrow the elite because the elite controls all the security services, all the guns, and generally they have no problem shooting their own people. Also, remember that the street in Saudi Arabia is fat. The national security strategy of most of the Gulf states is to give their people heart disease so they can't protest. And the Saudis have been very, very successful at that. That'll be up to the Israelis. It's going to go one of two directions. Either the Israelis are going to directly occupy it in perpetuity, in which case they will be fighting a series of guerrilla wars against the local population forever, or they clear out Hamas and then go home, rebuild the wall, and Hamas Mark II takes control. Either way, you're looking at a humanitarian disaster for this region for the foreseeable future. One of the fun things about Joe Biden is because he's older than the pyramids, he's seen the long stretch of history here, and he has come to a lot of conclusions about who the powers are worth sticking with over the long term once you like just kind of wave the bullshit away. And in his view, Israel, for all of its warts, and there are many, is still the only Western oriented country, is still the only country with the concept of human rights, is still the only country with a modern economy that can look after itself for the most part, is still the only democracy. And while it is flawed by all of those measures, it is better than Egypt or Lebanon or Syria or Jordan. And so if you have to choose, you might as well choose publicly and boldly. And that's exactly what he's done. Will that generate complications down the right line? Yeah, it's going to generate complications tomorrow. But making it very clear where the United States stands and the pecking order of this and other regions, you got to admit it's kind of refreshing compared to the presidents we've had for the last 25 years.
What are the complications? What's the risk of him doing this?
Well, the United States has been trying to get out of the Middle East for the last 20 years. We finally pulled it off under Biden. It was a mess with the Afghanistan withdrawal, but it freed up American strategic bandwidth for other things. Biden's now making it very clear that he doesn't really care what happens to the Palestinians because Israel is the friend, Israel is the family, Israel is the ally. That means that we are going to be in a situation where the street, and to a lesser degree, the elites of this entire region know exactly where they stand in American eyes. And that is going to force them to take certain policy changes that we're going to perceive as anti American. Now, I would argue that under the surface, we were already there. I mean, let's be honest. Most of the Arab world aren't friendly, and they're certainly not what I would consider pro American. But it's the United States establishing itself as a power broker without being a manager. And the Middle East has not had, I'm sorry, let me phrase it differently. The Middle East has not had this sort of strategic power vacuum for a very long time. It's going to lead to a lot of these smaller powers taking matters into their own hands. That's going to generate a lot more hot conflict. In the case of Israel, that's just an issue for the Palestinians. But for the case of the Saudis, that means all of a sudden they have to seriously consider arming themselves. For the Egyptians, it means that they're kind of on their own, and they're going to also have to make public stances vis-a-vis Israel and show exactly where they stand. It's a bracing moment. And this region has always been a mess. Biden's basically calling it a mess and picking sides. From a train wreck fascination point of view, this is going to get really interesting.